Drones didn't just add a new weapon to war. They changed what war actually is. Like, subscribe, and let's begin. For most of history, survival in war depended on one thing: cover. Terrain mattered because it could hide you. Distance mattered because it could protect you. Movement mattered because it allowed you to disappear, reposition, or delay contact. War was dangerous, but danger was unevenly distributed across space. Drones flattened that logic. At a systemic level, drones do not make the battlefield more lethal by themselves. They make it more transparent. What changes first is not firepower, but visibility. Fields, roads, tree lines, rooftops, all of them lose their protective ambiguity. The question is no longer whether a position is exposed, but how long it will remain unnoticed. This is a structural shift, not a tactical one. Cover used to be a property of space. A trench, a forest, a building, these were features you could rely on. With persistent aerial observation, cover becomes temporary. It exists only until it is seen. And once seen, it no longer functions as cover in the traditional sense. On the micro level, this changes behavior immediately. A unit does not move from safe area to dangerous area. It moves from unobserved to potentially observed. Every pause, every adjustment, every attempt to conceal leaves traces. Tracks, heat, pattern, repetition. Even when no strike follows, exposure accumulates. This creates a subtle but critical inversion. Earlier forms of war punished contact. Modern drone-enabled war punishes presence. You do not need to be engaged to be at risk. You only need to exist within a space that can be observed long enough. Firepower may still be limited. Ammunition may still be scarce. But visibility is not. And visibility alone is enough to collapse the old distinction between safety and danger. From the outside, this often looks like inactivity. No battle. No advance. No clear clash. From inside the system, it feels like constant constraint. Movement slows not because forces are weak, but because every action must account for exposure. Space no longer offers neutrality. It offers delay at best. This is why modern war begins with stillness. Not because nothing is happening, but because the environment itself has changed. Before anything collides, space is already being stripped of protection. Before any shot is fired, cover has already begun to fail. War without cover is not louder or more dramatic. It is quieter, slower, and far more restrictive. And once cover stops being reliable, everything that depends on it, maneuver, planning, timing, begins to change with it. What drones introduce is not occasional surveillance, but permanence. Earlier forms of reconnaissance were episodic. Observation had gaps. It depended on weather, timing, risk, and opportunity. You could be seen, but you could also wait it out. Darkness, terrain, and distance created natural blind spots. Observation was something you avoided or disrupted. Drones remove that rhythm. At a systemic level, observation becomes continuous. Not perfect, not total, but persistent enough to change behavior. It is no longer a question of if the enemy is watching, but when and how often. Even short interruptions stop mattering because coverage overlaps. One drone replaces another. One angle fills the gap left by the previous one. This is not about high-end technology. It is about density. Observation becomes cheap, repeatable, and scalable. Losing a drone does not end surveillance. It barely interrupts it. The system absorbs losses and continues to see. Vision stops being a scarce resource and becomes an ambient condition of the battlefield. On the micro level, this fundamentally alters perception. A soldier no longer reacts to being observed. Observation is assumed. What changes is not alertness, but baseline stress. There is no clear moment when surveillance begins, and no clear moment when it ends. You cannot break contact with the eye in the sky the way you once could with ground forces. This creates a continuous cognitive load. Decisions are no longer made against a backdrop of uncertainty, but against a backdrop of assumed exposure. Even when nothing happens, the absence of action does not signal safety. It only signals delay. Every minute spent under observation feels provisional, borrowed, conditional. This is where permanence matters. Temporary surveillance can be countered. Permanent surveillance reshapes behavior. Units move less, pause longer, and fragment their actions. Not because they are incapable, but because every movement risks triggering a chain of responses they cannot see. Observation becomes the first link in a sequence that may or may not end in a strike, but whose existence cannot be ignored. From the outside, this often looks like hesitation. From inside, it feels like compression. Time no longer belongs to the actor on the ground. It belongs to the system that observes, processes, and decides when exposure turns into action. The battlefield stops being a place where contact happens intermittently. It becomes a space where presence is continuously registered. Permanent observation does not make war faster. It makes it tighter. It reduces the margin for error before anything visible occurs. By the time action becomes obvious, the decisive phase has already passed, not because someone attacked, but because someone was seen long enough. And once observation becomes permanent, the battlefield is no longer defined by where fighting occurs, but by where visibility can be maintained. That is the condition everything else now operates under. In earlier wars, movement was protection. To move was to survive. Maneuver allowed forces to avoid contact, create surprise, and regain initiative. Speed and displacement were advantages because they disrupted the enemy's ability to react. Even risky movement offered opportunity. Standing still was often more dangerous than moving. Permanent observation reverses that logic. At a systemic level, movement no longer hides intent, it reveals it. Every relocation creates a signal. Tracks in terrain, changes in pattern, heat signatures, timing anomalies. Movement does not need to be fast or large to be detected. It only needs to be different from the background long enough to stand out. This turns maneuver into exposure. The battlefield no longer punishes contact first. It punishes motion. On the micro level, this produces an immediate behavioral shift. Units hesitate not because they lack orders, but because movement itself becomes the highest risk action. Advancing, repositioning, or withdrawing all carry similar dangers once visibility is assumed. The difference between attack and retreat collapses under the same observational pressure. As a result, time replaces space as the main variable. Instead of asking, "Where can we move?" decisions shift toward, "When can we afford to move?" Action becomes dependent on short windows, weather changes, sensor gaps, momentary overloads. Movement is no longer continuous. It is fragmented into brief, calculated bursts. This fragmentation has cascading effects. Coordination becomes harder because synchronization increases exposure. Large formations break down into smaller elements. Routes are chosen not for efficiency, but for irregularity. Predictability becomes more dangerous than slowness. From the outside, this looks like paralysis. From inside, it is constant calculation. The irony is that modern systems still reward speed, but only at the level of detection and response. On the ground, speed becomes situational and costly. The faster something moves, the easier it is to classify. The more decisive the maneuver, the clearer the signal it produces. Movement stops being a tool for initiative. It becomes a liability to be managed. This is why modern battlefields feel static without being inactive. Forces are not locked in place. They are constrained by visibility. Motion exists, but it is suppressed, delayed, and compressed into moments where risk briefly drops below intolerable levels. Once movement itself becomes dangerous, the entire grammar of warfare begins to shift. Planning, timing, coordination, all of it must now account for the fact that doing something is often more revealing than waiting. And that sets the conditions for the next transformation. Traditionally, a kill zone was a location. It was a defined area, chosen in advance, where firepower could be concentrated. It had boundaries, timing, and direction. To be inside it was dangerous. To be outside it was not. The kill zone was an exception, a moment when space briefly became lethal. Drones erase that distinction. At a systemic level, the kill zone detaches from geography. It no longer needs to be prepared, marked, or even recognized in advance. It emerges dynamically, wherever observation is sustained long enough for a response to form. The trigger is not entry into a specific area, but prolonged exposure within a visible one. The kill zone becomes conditional. It does not exist until it does, and by then, it is already active. Space is no longer divided into safe and unsafe areas. It is divided into currently observed and not yet observed. The moment observation stabilizes, the possibility of engagement stabilizes with it. Lethality no longer depends on intent alone. It depends on duration. On the micro level, this is deeply destabilizing. A person on the ground cannot tell when they have entered a kill zone, because there is no clear boundary to cross. There is no signal, no warning, no transition. The only thing that changes is time. The longer you remain visible, the closer you move toward a threshold you cannot see. This alters behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Positions feel unsafe even when nothing happens. Pauses become stressful. Repetition feels dangerous. The absence of immediate action no longer reassures, it unsettles. The question is no longer, are we under fire, but how long have we been visible? The kill zone stops being an event. It becomes a background condition. From the outside, this looks inefficient. Why not move? Why not act? Why not press forward? From inside the system, the logic is different. Every second spent in one place accumulates risk. Every additional trace increases the probability that exposure will convert into action. The system does not need to strike immediately. It only needs to wait until the conditions align. This is why drones change the meaning of control. Control is no longer exercised by holding ground or denying access. It is exercised by shaping where and how long the enemy can exist without consequence. Space itself becomes a variable weapon, not because it is mined or fortified, but because it is watched. Once the kill zone loses its boundaries, the front line loses its clarity. There is no single place where danger begins. There is only a gradient of exposure that intensifies with time. War no longer hinges on crossing lines. It hinges on how long someone remains visible before the system decides to act. And when lethality is no longer tied to a place, but to a condition, the battlefield stops being something you enter. It becomes something you are already inside. The most destabilizing effect of drones is not what they destroy. It is what they make cheap. Vision used to be costly. Reconnaissance required specialized assets, risk, coordination, and time. Seeing the enemy was an operation in itself. Drones collapse that cost. At a systemic level, observation becomes inexpensive, redundant, and disposable. Losing a drone barely interrupts surveillance. Vision stops being a scarce resource and becomes baseline. When seeing is cheap, mistakes become expensive. A small lapse no longer fades into uncertainty. It stands out. It is detected, logged, and acted upon. It costs very little to notice a mistake. It costs a lot to make one. On the micro level, this creates a constant pressure to be perfect in an environment that does not allow it. Human behavior is inherently inconsistent. Fatigue sets in. Attention drifts. Procedures slip. Under permanent observation, these normal deviations stop being tolerable. They become liabilities. This is why modern war feels unforgiving. There is no proportionality between the size of an error and its consequences. A minor misjudgment can trigger a response far larger than the action that caused it. Not because the response is emotional, but because the system is optimized to exploit any detectable deviation. From the outside, this often looks like overreaction. Why respond so strongly to something so small? From inside the system, the logic is clear. The cost of acting is low. The cost of waiting is uncertainty. When vision is cheap, the safest option is often to respond immediately, before the opportunity degrades. This creates a feedback loop. Cheap observation encourages rapid response. Rapid response reduces tolerance for error. Reduced tolerance increases pressure. Over time, this pressure reshapes behavior. Forces become conservative not because they are weak, but because the penalty for deviation is high. Initiative narrows. Creativity becomes risky. The safest action is often inaction, not because it is effective, but because it avoids creating a signal. This is the hidden economy of drone warfare. It is not about replacing expensive weapons with cheaper ones. It is about replacing uncertainty with visibility, and shifting the cost of war onto the side that cannot avoid being seen. When vision is abundant and mistakes are amplified, war stops rewarding boldness. It rewards error management. And in a system where errors are inevitable, that changes who holds the advantage, not in moments of action, but over time. The most profound effect of drones is not tactical. It is psychological. Earlier forms of war concentrated stress around moments of contact. Fear peaked during engagement and receded afterward. There were lulls, rear areas, pauses where the nervous system could reset. Even prolonged danger had rhythm. Permanent observation destroys that rhythm. At a systemic level, drones externalize pressure onto time rather than action. The system does not need to attack to exert control. It only needs to remain present. The human under observation is forced into a constant state of readiness without a clear trigger for release. This creates a unique kind of strain. On the micro level, the individual is not responding to fire, but to anticipation. There is no clear signal that danger has begun, and no confirmation that it has passed. Every sound, every delay, every repetition becomes suspect. The mind is forced to continuously simulate outcomes it cannot verify. This is not panic. It is erosion. Decision-making degrades not because people stop caring, but because they care all the time. Attention cannot remain sharp indefinitely. Fatigue accumulates without a visible cause. Stress has no endpoint to attach itself to. Under these conditions, behavior changes in predictable ways. Risk tolerance narrows. Initiative declines. People default to the safest visible option, even when it is strategically suboptimal. Not moving feels safer than moving. Waiting feels safer than acting. The absence of immediate threat becomes misleadingly comforting, even when long-term exposure increases danger. From the outside, this looks like passivity. From inside, it feels like survival. The drone does not need to strike to shape outcomes. Its presence alone alters posture, tempo, and judgment. The human adapts not to combat, but to being watched. Over time, this adaptation becomes internalized. The individual begins to self-regulate as if the observer were always active, because it often is. This is where the system gains leverage. A person under constant observation becomes predictable. Not because they follow orders, but because they minimize deviation. Creativity, improvisation, and initiative carry psychological cost. Repetition feels safer, even when it is not. The drone does not replace fear. It redistributes it. Instead of sharp spikes, there is a flat, sustained pressure that slowly reshapes behavior. The individual remains functional, but narrower. Capable, but constrained. Present, but cautious. This is not a failure of courage or discipline. It is a rational response to an environment where visibility never fully goes away. And when enough individuals adapt this way, the effect scales upward. Units slow. Systems stiffen. War becomes less about decisive moments and more about gradual exhaustion. Not because people are breaking, but because they are constantly holding themselves together. The concept of a battlefield assumes boundaries. A place where war happens, and places where it does not. An area of concentrated risk surrounded by relative safety. Even when front lines shifted, the idea itself remained stable. War was spatially contained. Drones dissolve that containment. At a systemic level, the battlefield no longer exists as a discrete location. What matters is not where forces are, but where visibility can be maintained. Any space that can be observed long enough can become operationally relevant. Any area that supports detection, tracking, or targeting becomes part of the conflict. The battlefield turns into a network. Fields, roads, urban blocks, supply routes, staging areas, none of these are behind the lines in a meaningful sense. They are nodes in a system where exposure, not proximity to combat, determines relevance. Distance loses its protective value. Depth no longer guarantees safety. This is a structural collapse, not an expansion. War does not spread everywhere at once. It spreads selectively, following visibility. On the micro level, this changes how space is experienced. There is no clear transition from safe to unsafe. No moment when someone enters the battlefield. The environment feels neutral until it suddenly isn't, not because anything visible changes, but because observation stabilizes. This produces a strange dissonance. Daily activity continues. Logistics move. People work, wait, and adapt. Yet every space feels provisional. The absence of visible danger no longer implies protection. It only implies that nothing has happened yet. From the outside, this often looks like normality. From inside, it feels conditional. The collapse of the battlefield also reshapes planning. Traditional planning relied on spatial assumptions, zones of control, rear areas, staging grounds. When visibility reaches everywhere, those distinctions blur. Planning becomes reactive, focused on managing exposure rather than controlling terrain. This is why modern conflicts feel diffuse. There are no clear maps that explain what is happening. No single line to cross, hold, or defend. Pressure appears in one place, disappears, then re-emerges elsewhere. The conflict feels scattered, even when it follows a coherent internal logic. The battlefield has not expanded. It has evaporated. What remains is a contested environment where relevance is determined moment by observation, processing, and response. War no longer announces where it is happening. It reveals itself only through effects, delays, disruptions, constraints. Once the battlefield disappears, so does the idea of fighting somewhere else. There is no elsewhere. There is only space that is currently ignored, and space that is currently watched. And that distinction can change faster than anyone on the ground can react. That is the final transformation drones accelerate. War stops being tied to a place, and becomes something that follows visibility wherever it goes. Drones did not make war more violent. They made it more visible. And that visibility changes what war fundamentally is. For most of history, war was understood as collision. Forces met, clashed, disengaged, and regrouped. Power was expressed through contact. The decisive moments were concentrated in time and space. You could point to where the war happened and when it mattered most. Drone-enabled war breaks that structure. At a systemic level, war shifts from collision to exposure. The primary struggle is no longer about destroying the enemy at a decisive point, but about keeping them visible long enough for pressure to accumulate. Observation becomes action. Presence becomes risk. Time under exposure replaces contact as the central variable. This is not a change in tactics. It is a change in logic. War no longer needs to force confrontation. It shapes behavior indirectly, by narrowing options. The system does not ask the enemy to fight. It asks them to exist under conditions where every choice carries detectable consequence. On the micro level, this reframes experience. A person no longer feels like they are moving toward or away from battle. They feel like they are managing visibility. Decisions are judged not by boldness or initiative, but by how much exposure they create. Success becomes the ability to remain operational without triggering response, not through concealment, but through restraint. This is why modern war feels slow and unresolved. Exposure accumulates quietly. Pressure builds without spectacle. Outcomes emerge gradually, often without a single moment that feels decisive. The conflict advances not through breakthroughs, but through constraints that tighten over time. Collision still happens, but it is no longer the core mechanism. The decisive phase often occurs before contact, in the long period where observation stabilizes and options shrink. By the time violence becomes visible, the structure of the situation has already been shaped. This is what drones accelerate. They do not replace soldiers or weapons. They compress the gap between being seen and being acted upon. They turn space into a conditional resource and time into a liability. They make exposure continuous, even when action is delayed. War, in this form, does not need constant fighting to progress. It progresses by limiting freedom of movement, freedom of planning, and freedom of error. Understanding this matters, because it explains why modern conflicts look unfamiliar. Why there are no clear fronts, no decisive moments, no clean endings. The war is not missing those elements. It no longer depends on them. Modern war is not defined by where forces collide. It is defined by how long they remain visible. And once exposure becomes the dominant condition, war stops being something you enter at a point in time or space. It becomes something you exist inside, as long as you can be seen.